Alright, so in this video, we will be going through factoring trinomials. So again, we have worked on factoring the greatest common factor. We have factored by grouping, and we have also factored difference of squares. GCF, always. If I could spell always check for first. Once you've checked for the GCF, grouping, remember there were four terms to group, and difference of squares was two terms, and it was a difference of two squares, so something like x squared minus 25. That was the difference of squares. So that's, again, kind of getting into how we know what to do, but that leads us into when we factor trinomials, what we're looking for is something with three terms. So three terms would be a clue that I should factor this the trinomial given the method we're about to use. So we're going to make a connection first, and that connection is going to be what we did last unit, and that was multiplying. So I think at this point a lot of you are just fine multiplying this out by, also just as a quick reminder, just make sure you are taking notes, right? You're writing this down. Pause the video, write down the examples, and then follow along with the examples, please. So just make sure you're doing that as a benefit for yourself. Just watching will not help, right? Make sure you are following through. Okay. So back to what we were talking about. Many of you, I think, we're getting to the point where you could simply just multiply this out using your distributing lines. Making sure you distribute twice. Just want to connect this back to the rectangle or area model because it'll help some of you organize your guessing and checking, which is what we're about to do. So just to kind of quickly go through, remember how we set this up. We had x and 2, x and -5. The first round of distributing, x times x was x squared. X times -5 is -5x, and then the 2 times x is 2x, and 2 times -5 is -10, and then we had to combine like terms, right? So we combine like terms, and we end up with our answer of x squared minus 3x minus 10. And that is it. That was our answer. We multiplied. Okay, so just remember what we did there. We multiplied those two binomials together. So now what I want to do is, in this unit, we're going to be working on factoring. And so notice, actually I'm just going to point this out right away. Notice what we are starting with here is the answer that we just got. Right, so we just got this answer, and just to remind you that, remember factoring, factoring is the opposite of multiplying and vice versa, right? Factoring and multiplying or distributing are opposites. So that means what we're about to do is figure out how to take this and get back to this. Okay, now it's pretty easy because our final answer to this is going to be the x plus 2 and x minus 5. But if I hadn't known that to start, what we want to start looking at is, okay, so how do we work backwards? And again, what I want to do is, to start, is set this up with the area model. And if you start to notice some patterns here with the area model, you'll notice that, again, if we're factoring, right, if we're factoring, then we are given, quote unquote, the area. So that means we have the x squared, we have this -10, but then here's the issue. The issue is that these two spaces are the two spaces that created this term, this -3x. And so what I don't quite know is how that was split up. I mean, I do because I can see right over here, right? The 2x and -5x. But if I'm truly working backwards without having multiplied this out already, then I don't really know. So here's where we're going to start guessing and checking. And so here's what we're going to do, right? So one other thing to remember is when we're factoring, we are finding, sorry about that, we are trying to figure out the sides of the rectangle. So here's what I know right now. I know this has to be an x and this has to be an x. So those are the only two things when you multiply them together to get x squared. Here's the other two things I know currently is that whatever these two things are, right, so this space and this space, they have to get me a -10 multiplied together, right? So whatever multiplies together to get -10 is what those two things have to be. So if I'm not sure, well, I can start with just thinking about, okay, so what kind of things multiply together to get 10? Well, 1 and 10, 2 and 5. If it has to be negative, then one of them has to be negative. So here's where we can start just kind of playing with the numbers. I'm going to go ahead and say, well, let's try 1 and 10. Well, if I fill in a 1 here and a 10 here, well, one of them has to be negative, so let's say the 1's negative. So here's where we have to check. We have to check the middle term. And if I check this, then here's what we have so far. We would have this area would be 10x, and this area would be -x. Well, those do not combine together to get -3x. So here's what I might try. One of them has to be negative, so what if I made the -10, the 10 negative? Well, so -10 times 1 is -10. That gets me the -10 part, but if I check, like I did before, -10x would be here and x would be here. That does not combine together to get -3x. So here's what that tells me. That tells me that there's no way this could be a 1 and a 10. And so that means I've checked those two factors, so it can't be those. So let's check the 2 and the 5. So I'm going to put 5 here and 2 here. And again, I know one of them has to be negative. So what if I make the 2 negative? Well, again, if I multiply those to get the areas inside now to check, right, because I know 5 times -2 is -10. And here I get -2x, and here I get 5x. So again, at this point, those two things add up to 3x, but I need it to add up to -3x. So if I switch the sign, there, x and a -5 and then x and a +2, well now this is +2x and this is -5x, and now those two terms added together gets me -3x. And so what I've just found are the two sides, right? So these two sides are my answer. Those are the two factors, right? So when I'm factoring, it's the outside of the rectangle area model that are my answers. So my two answers are x minus 5 and x plus 2. Now, once again, you might notice that those, right, so right there, those two are the same. They're not the same order, but they're the same two factors, right? So I have an x plus 2 and an x minus 5, x plus 2, x minus 5. Those are the same. So working backwards, there's a little bit more work to do, but we can use a lot of the connections we made with the area model to help us work that out. And eventually, you don't necessarily need the area model, but to kind of help you think about what you're trying to do, I think it's good to start off with. So at this point, we're going to move on, and on your screen, you can see kind of a list of things we're going to go through. So you can pause the video and write those down. I would do that just so you have them in a spot. But we're going to talk through a lot of this over and over. So take a moment to write them down, and then we'll come back and just go through these as we continue on here. Okay, so let's go and check out number 3. Again, take a moment, write these down. Okay, and so I'm going to use the area model again. I'm going to set that up with the area model and say, okay, so again, p squared goes there, 80 is positive, goes there. And again, it's the middle term, the negative 18, that comes from those two areas added together. So again, there's kind of 4 spots I have to try to figure out here. I'm going to start with the 2 that I know. I know this is p and p. Because you can only do p times p to get p squared. So then again, I need to start with things that I know multiply to 80. So here's where making a list of things that multiply to this number is a good idea. So 1 and 80, 2 and 40, 3 no, 4 and 20, 5 and 16, 6 no, 7 no, 8 yes, 10, and then 9 nope. So just remember the list, right? This list is a very simple process. You always start with 1 in the number, right? So 1 in the number, and then just start going down the list 2, 3, 4, and just take your calculator. 80 divided by 2, 80 divided by 3, 80 divided by 4, 80 divided by 5. And looking for whole numbers, right? So once I have this list, it narrows your work down a lot, okay? Because you're only focusing on these things. These are the only things that multiply to 80. So whatever this is, right, whatever goes here and here has to come from these sets of numbers. It's now down to looking at this term, the sign. So the sign of this term is a negative, and so we have to pay attention to that. So that means a couple things. The sign that it adds up to is negative, but the term that these multiply to is positive. So the only way to get a positive answer is if you have 2 positives multiplied or 2 negatives. So these are either both positive or both negative. And I actually know they're both negative because they have to add up to a negative. So in order for them to add up to a negative, they have to both be negative. 2 positives added together are never negative. So I know right away that these 2 numbers, these 2 values, are actually both negative. So if I work through and kind of go through the same process, I can always start at the top of my list, 1 and 80. So 1 and 80. But when I check this, negative 80p and negative 1p, if you notice really what I'm doing here at this point is I'm really just kind of adding these 2 numbers together then. Because that's what these 2 end up being. So as I'm checking this, I can kind of start to do this a little bit quicker than what it maybe originally seemed. And so I know those 2 things do not add up to negative 18. And some of you might be able to look at this list of numbers and say right away which of these are going to add up to negative 18. Because again, remember, we know these are all negative. And so as I'm checking these, negative 2 and negative 40 does not add up to negative 18. Negative 4 and negative 20 does not add up to negative 18. Negative 5 and negative 16 does not add up to negative 18. Negative 8 and negative 10 does add up to negative 18. And if I check that, it should have been gone from there. If I check this, negative 10p and negative 8p, those 2 things add up to negative 18p. So once again, my answer, just remember, when we're factoring, my answer is the sides of my area model. So P, whoa, that's weird. Used the wrong thing. So P minus 8 and P minus 10. Those are my two answers. Last one here that I want to show you how to do without the area model. What we're going to start noticing is, what we want to try to notice are the patterns. So what I can actually do is, I know my answer, right? So our answers have been looking like this, right? So my answer is going to have, if you go back to those steps above, set up two bubbles, and inside each bubble, what we can do is kind of think about, in the process of distributing two binomials together, this first term comes from taking this first thing in each parenthesis and multiplying it together. So these two things together have to multiply together to get n squared. So once again, there's only one way to do that, just n and n. The last parts of each parenthesis, when you multiply those together, those have to add up to negative 14. And then the middle term, right, so that middle term, negative 5n, that comes from these two terms multiplied together and these two terms. Okay, so when you combine those two terms, the green, that's what gets you the negative 5n. So here's where I need to check, again, things that multiply to 14. Well, I'm still probably going to need to maybe think about a list. So 14, so 1 and 14, 2 and 7, that's it. So again, in this case, they have to multiply to a negative. So that means one of them has to be positive and one of them has to be negative, right? So in this list, either one has to be positive and 14 negative, or vice versa. So I'm just going to start guessing. So here's my guess. I think maybe it's negative 1 and positive 14. So here's how I check that. Once again, I started with things that I know, right? So these multiply together to get negative 14. I'm starting with those things that I know. It's the green part that I have to check. And this time the green terms end up being negative 1n and 14n. Well, when you combine negative 1n and 14n, that does not get you negative 5n. That gets you 13n. So you might think, oh, well, what happens? What if you switch the sign? Does that matter this time? Well, let's check. Well, so now what that changes is, now I end up with, this is negative 14 and this is positive 1. But now that just adds up to negative 13. So instead of positive 13, it's now just negative 13. So what that tells me is, no, it's not 14 and 1. It is a positive and a negative, but it's not 14 and 1. So that one's out. So I only have one more thing to check. So I'm going to start by saying positive 7, negative 2. Once again, those two things I know multiply to negative 14. It's the green part that I have to check. So this one is negative 2n, and this is 7n. And those added together get me positive 5n, which is close to positive, but I need to be negative. So here's where, if I notice it's positive but I need it to be negative, that just means I need to switch the signs. So I need that to be negative 7n and positive 2. Once again, I still know those two things multiply together to get negative 14, but now I have a negative 7n and a positive 2n. And those two things added together should have been a negative, yeah, so negative 7n. Those two things added together get me negative 5n. So my final answer in this case, is right here. N minus 7 and n plus 2. That is my final answer. Okay. So here's what I want you to try. I want you to start working through these and see if you can get them done. Try them and see how you do, and then go back through and see the answers, and then move on to the further practice that is provided. So here's the setup for 5 and 6. Again, if you tried them, here's just a little bit more of a talk through on these first couple, and then you'll just see the answers for the next two. So again, we're looking for, starting with the setup, we're looking for the spaces outside. So again, we're going to start with the things we know, R and R, and then things that multiply to 12. Well, I can just start checking right away if I feel comfortable. So 1 and 12, I know multiply to 12, it's positive. And then I notice that the green term adds up to a positive as well, so I know everything here is positive. There's no negatives involved. But 12R and 1R do not add up to positive 7, so those two things don't work. So what I can do is continue on my list. So I did 1 and 12, 2 and 6. So I end up with 6R and 2R. Those two things add up to 7, or 8R rather, so close, but not quite. So then I have one more thing to check, 3 and 4, and I end up with 4R and 3R, and those two things do add up to 7R. So once again, oops, didn't mean to do that. Once again, it's the sides of the rectangle that are the answer, right? So everything's positive, R plus 3, R plus 4. Once again, the connection here is if you were to multiply this back together, you'd end up with the original expression. Okay. For number 6, let's check this one out here. Again, we know this has to be n and n. And then again, starting with things that multiply to 8, 1 and 8. Those are easy things to check, but it has to multiply to a positive, right? So it multiplies to a positive, but the green term combines to be negative. So what that means is I know these two things, whatever they are, have to be negative. A negative times a negative is positive, and then when you add two negatives, it stays negative. Okay? So if I now finish checking this, negative 8 and negative 1n, those do not add up to, that does not add up to negative 6n. So I know it's not negative 1 and negative 8. The only other things I can check are negative 2 and negative 4. So again, negative 2 times negative 4 is negative, or positive 8. Negative 4n would be here, negative 2n would be here. And that does combine to get me my negative 6n. So final answer, n minus 2, n minus 4. Once again, if you were to multiply this back out, I would end up with the original expression that I started with. Okay, go ahead and write these down and try them, and then continue on. Okay, so here are your answers. I'm guessing you maybe did a little bit more guessing and checking, but a couple of key things to remember. You are basically starting, right, without the area model, you're starting with two bubbles, right, two parentheses, two factors. And then you are starting with things that you know, right? You know to get x squared, you would have to take an x times an x. So those first two spots have to be an x and an x. For the next part, in order to get a negative 60 here, you have to be taking things that you multiply together to get negative 60. So that's where I know these two things have to multiply to negative 60 because that's where that negative 60 term comes from. So after checking everything, I narrowed it down to negative 10 and positive 6 because the green term, when I calculate the green term, I get 6x and negative 10x, and those two things combined together get me that negative 4x. Okay, so I'm using this idea of working backwards from distributing to help me figure out what those things are. Same thing with the second one, number 8. Again, I know to get x squared comes from multiplying these two things together, so they have to be an x and an x. In order to get negative 20, these two things have to multiply together to get negative 20. And so then when I check, when I say the checking step, I'm checking the green term, the middle term. And when I multiply those together and combine, I end up with that positive 1x term. So again, this method, I'm not sure I've said this enough during this video, but this method is called guess and check. The guessing, we're really narrowing down our guessing. It's not like we're just randomly guessing annual numbers. The guessing and checking, really the name of the game here, comes from the middle term. It's this middle term that we have to guess and check on a little bit here, but we can start by narrowing it down to things that we know for sure. And the things that we know for sure are that first term and the last term. First term, the last term. Starting there and then checking the middle term. So here's some practice for you. You can try these. I'm going to show one. You'll want to pause it. I'll show one and then pause it. Show one and then pause it. Give yourself a chance to try it, and then you can see how you're doing here. Okay? So when I put one up here, pause it, try it out, and then go ahead and attempt it or check your work. So try that one out. Factor. And there's your answer. Here's the next one. And check your work. Again, here's where just remember, if you were to redistribute this, right, x times x is where that x squared comes from. The middle term, when you multiply these two things together and add them, that's where the 6x comes from. And the 2 and the 4 are where the 8 come from. Here's the next one. This one's set up a little bit differently. I give you one factor. See if you can figure out what the other factor is. So the other factor is another x plus 3, right? You're just thinking about what's missing that would fill in to get the polynomial that you're given. This one is going to be, some of these are going to be similar to that style. Here's the next one. Again, you're filling in the missing factor. Try to figure out what needs to go in the first parenthesis to get you this. There's that one, and one more. And there's the missing factor. Oh, one more. Surprise! So this one you had to do it completely, right? So again, the two factors, just again to talk through this real quick. I know this has to be an x, this has to be an x. And then to get negative 20 and add up to positive 1x, the two numbers that multiply to negative 20 and add up to positive 1 would be positive 5 and negative 4. Positive 5 times negative 4 is negative 20. Positive 5 times negative 4 is positive 1. Okay, so at this point, you probably have some Khan Academy to work on for factoring trinomials. Please don't hesitate to use the hints and the tips and the videos from Khan Academy, especially in this time. Feel free to shoot me email questions as well, but this is really just going to take practice and sometimes watching other examples further. Googling or YouTubing factoring trinomials, right? If you, right here, this, factoring trinomials and guess and check. YouTubing that, just typing in factoring trinomials, guess and check. There are plenty of videos out there that maybe the way someone else explains it maybe helps you a little bit more. But there are plenty of resources there to help you continue working at practicing this. Okay, and that's the key, practice.